In this video, I'm going to show you how to place your front wheel bearing hub assembly on this Ford F-450. Let's get started. With a 21mm socket, remove all 10 of your lug nuts and then remove the wheel. Let's remove the 10mm bolt that holds the bracket for the brake line in place, or the brake hose. You want to do this to give you some extra slack on that brake hose once you remove the caliper. These can be fairly rusty, so try not to break this off. Remove it all the way, and then we'll free up the bracket. There we go. Now I want to remove the entire caliper assembly, so caliper with bracket. It has two 24mm bolts that go from the back side right here. I'm going to take the first one off, and then I'm going to actually leave it on a few threads so it can hold the entire assembly while I take the lower one off. You can remove this one completely, and I suggest having a bungee cord or something ready to hold this caliper, move it out of the way, and then actually hook it onto the frame or wherever you're going to hold it with something secure. Basically, you don't want to put any pressure on this brake hose because it's heavy and you can damage it. Take this bolt out, hold the caliper of course, otherwise it will fall. Lift it up and out. There you go, tie it out of your way. Once again, make sure it doesn't put pressure on the brake hose. Now to get this off, we actually have to unbolt it from the studs that poke through the rotor from the wheel bearing, and you'll need a 21mm socket. Unfortunately, you can only fit a low profile socket in there, and you're going to have to put it on the mounting nut over here and then run an extension through the hole in this hub surface here, and only then can you get to it. Now sure, could you get it with a wrench? Yes, so if you don't have this, use a wrench, but it's pretty tight. Now we just have to go around and take all of these off. Every time you're done with one, you have to separate your extension from your socket, get the mounting nut off, and then move on to the next one. Last one. At this point, you can take a hammer or rubber mallet. I'll start gentle with a rubber mallet. Try to break this free off of the rotor or the wheel bearing studs here. But there's nothing else holding it on, so just make sure it doesn't fall off. So hold it. There we go, it's separating. So I'm going to wiggle it back and forth, try to pull it straight out. There you have it, set it aside. Remove the rotor now. Now we have to take the locking hub off, and because it has little Torx T27 bolts, and they are prone to stripping out, I'm going to scrape off any debris that's inside here with a pick so that my socket can actually grip on properly. I'm going to do this to all of them. These look like they're in fairly good shape. A lot of times they are rotted, so if needed, spray them with rust penetrant, although I'm not sure if that will actually penetrate into the threads. But the key here is to make sure your socket is well seated all the way down into the head of that bolt, and they're not very tight. You just have to make sure you grip onto it properly, and we'll remove all three. There are three of them. At this point, this should be able to slide out. If you can't remove it because it's seized on here, use a little screwdriver, pry bar, and break it free off of the hub. Carefully slide it out. Set this aside. With that removed, you can see a snap ring right in the center there. You'll need some snap ring pliers. Make sure they're strong enough because this is a fairly large snap ring. Once you get the pliers in there, squeeze it. You want to expand it and pull it straight out. There it is. Let's remove the ABS wire now. Take it off the knuckle. It's held on with this 8mm bolt. You're going to have to squeeze your socket in here, loosen it up, take it out completely. The new wheel bearing comes with a new ABS wire, so you don't have to worry about saving any of this. There we go. Save the bolt though, we will reuse that. Let's move along. Follow the ABS wire along and you'll see where it's clipped in on the front axle here, right below the coil spring. These are also supposed to be 8mm bolts. Unfortunately, they are very rotted, but I hammered a 7mm on and was able to fit it on here and break it free. Now it looks like somebody has already been here since the ABS wire is tied on the outside here, but we're going to remove these bolts, take the clips out since the new ABS wire will come with new clips. So we'll reuse those. So we'll install new ones of those. Take this off of here, and there is another one right over there. And further along, there's this one. Take this one off as well. There we go. Follow it along. Pop this out with a trim tool. Keep going. This one, you don't have to remove the entire retainer. You can just stick your trim tool here and open it up. It opens like a clamshell. You can pop the wire out. Keep following it along and you'll see the electrical connector right here next to the frame. Press on the tab and disconnect it. Now pull the wiring through, and I like to wrap it around the wheel bearing so that it's secured in one spot, and when I go to remove it, it's not going to dangle around. There we go. Just leave it right here. On the back side of the knuckle, you have 4 21mm mounting nuts. 2 are on this side, 2 are on the other side. We'll start here. Doesn't matter where you start, as long as you take all of them off, of course. There's one. Take this off. Oh, looks like it pulled out the entire stud. That's all right. Sometimes that happens. We do have new hardware, and I always recommend getting new hardware if yours doesn't already come with it. Let's move on to the lower one. Okay, this one pulled out just the mounting nut. The stud stayed in. That's all right. Now on the other side, let's do the same thing. Take that off. And the one at the bottom, because the tie rod is still on, I'm going to need a swivel. If you don't have a swivel, you can take the tie rod off. Take a hammer and tap the wheel bearing to get it off of here. We still have 3 studs, so it can't go sideways. It has to pull straight out because of those studs. Ours actually did break free as I was removing that last mounting nut. It's separated. Sometimes they're seized on here and you need a larger hammer and a lot of swinging at it until it breaks free. In my case, I'm just going to use this and tap it straight out. So it's moving, but I have to go back and forth because as soon as it goes at an angle, it gets stuck since those studs don't allow it to pivot. Wiggle it off. There it is. Inside here, I like to clean off the old grease. Doesn't have to be perfect, but I wipe it off and I apply new grease so that it's properly lubricated. And it's important to do this. A lot of times there's actually rust built up here. There's an O-ring on the wheel bearing that seals this up. If it fails, rust will build up here from moisture. And as you can see, someone has already replaced this wheel bearing and has had to grind off some rust. You can see by the marks. That's fine, that's normal. I've done that before also because you need this surface to be smooth so that O-ring can seal up. Wipe off the axle shaft, the splines, make sure there's no debris on here. This groove right here, right after the splines, that's where that snap ring sits. You want to make sure this is nice and clean. And now, like I said, I'm going to apply new grease, but before I do that, we also have to clean up this ridge here where the wheel bearing sits, because if there's rust built up on here and it's not a perfectly even surface, it'll sit at an angle. I know it's a microscopic difference, but when it comes to bolting up the wheel all the way out here, it's not going to sit flat. So you need to make sure that this surface is nice and smooth. Whether you need to sand it or grind it off, or just use a wire brush, whatever you have to do. In my case, I'm going to use a soft sanding pad and just make sure that this is nice and clean. Spray this off with brake parts cleaner. Avoid trying to shoot it straight into there. Just try to keep it general out here, just so we can remove all contaminants. And wipe it off with a rag, of course. Now I'm going to apply a thin layer of grease in here. Just going to coat this surface. You can also use anti-seize if you want, but grease usually works better with rubber O-rings. I'm going to apply some on the splines of the axle. Right here, right over here, on this part. Kind of coat everything in a thin layer of grease, not only for rust protection, but so it can, the wheel bearing can slide on easy. And this surface right here, you can either continue using grease and just lather it on, or anti-seize, whatever you prefer. Any type of rust preventative coating will do the job. Let's put the O-ring on the new wheel bearing. It should come with it. I don't recommend reusing the old one. Line it up and loop it around. If you have grease on your gloves from greasing up the hub or the knuckle, that's even better because it allows this to slide on easily. Now let's install the studs into the wheel bearing. The threads are equal on both sides. It's the same thread, so you don't have to worry about putting one in over the other. And you want to thread them in all the way down. And to fully tighten them, you have two options. One, you can do the double nut method, which is basically installing two mounting nuts, tightening them up against each other, and then use that to thread it in. Or on this flat shank right here, you can use some locking pliers. Definitely don't use it on the threads. Clamp it down, and with this in the vise, you can just twist it until it doesn't want to twist anymore. It doesn't have to be extremely tight, because when you put the nuts on this side, not only does it tighten up here, but naturally the stud's going to want to pull that way, and it actually puts pressure and tightens both sides. So do the same to the rest of them. Install all 4 studs. Now take the new wheel bearing, make sure the ABS sensor is up at the top, and line up the 4 studs and slide it in. If it doesn't want to slide in, use a rubber mallet and gently tap it. Don't tap on the ABS sensor though, or the wire. Most likely it's because of rust buildup inside the holes for the studs here. That's pretty much bottomed out. So let's go put the mounting nuts on. Now let's put the mounting nuts on. Start them all on by hand. And then when we tighten them, go in a cross pattern so that you can seat this wheel bearing completely up against the knuckle. Sometimes if you tighten just 2 and it's not fully seated already, it'll kink and get jammed up at an angle. And sometimes, even if you tighten it tight on the other side, it doesn't pull through all the way, and it can actually stay at an angle, which isn't a good thing. So let's put the other side on and bottom them all out. Once again, in a cross pattern. "133 foot-pounds in a cross pattern is the torque for this. That's it right there. Bring the ABS wire behind the shock. It's important. That's where it's supposed to be routed. And pull it through all the way. Now let's start attaching it everywhere where it goes. Secure the ABS sensor to the wire. I know the old one wasn't properly secured. This is how it's supposed to be, with the clip facing to the side and the bolt going through. You want to make sure that it's properly secured, because if it's not, the rotor will actually make contact with it and cut through it eventually. So Make sure it's out of the way of where the rotor would go. That's nice and snug. Let's move on. Follow it along, and you'll see right here on the spring seat, you can reconnect it here with the 2 bolts. There's one. I'm going to put the other one in, and then I'll tighten both. Nice and snug. Same to this one. Resecure it right here. Pop that clip all the way down. There we go. And move along over here. Clamp it back down into this retainer. Plug it back in. Take your new snap ring, which should have come with the new bearing. Stretch it and put it in there. Sometimes you can't because you need something to push it in with so that it falls into its groove. So in that case, I'm going to hold it like this, and usually I like to take a pry bar, and as I expand it, push it in. Yep, sometimes it doesn't work first try, but that's all right. We'll try again. The idea is to expand it and then push it so it kind of snaps over. Now once you get it in, you need to make sure that it's actually seated. As you can see, I don't think it is on this side, so I'm going to take a pry bar and a little rubber mallet, and there we go. That's just fully seated. Give it a couple taps all the way around. And there you have it. That's seated. Before we put the locking hub actuator back in, remove the old gasket. If yours is still stuck on here, you can use a razor blade to scrape it. Get as much of this corrosion off as you can. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can either put a new gasket on or just use some RTV, which is what I'm going to do. But you need to make sure it has a good surface to seal up against. This is good enough. Let's degrease it with some brake parts cleaner. And I'm going to do the same over here because this is where the RTV is going to sit. I won't directly spray on this though. I'm going to spray on my rag and wipe this clean so that there are no oils interfering with the RTV. I always like to add a little bit of extra grease to these splines so that when you do engage four-wheel drive, it's a nice and smooth engagement with no grinding gears or anything like that. I also want to clean off this O-ring a little bit. There's some sand and other debris on here. And put the leftover grease on here just so it can slide in smoothly. Now take a little bit of RTV and just put a thin coating on this area right here. Unless you have the paper gasket, of course. Either works. Now slide this on. Oh, there we go. Should slide on all the way. Start the 3 bolts back in. And tighten them up. You don't have to make these very tight, just snug and a little bit extra. They are very small and they do break easily, so try to be gentle. So as soon as it bottoms out, about 1/8 of a turn, that's all it takes. It's bottomed out, that's it. Double check them. There you have it. Now coat the new hub surface area here with anti-seize. You can also use grease, but anti-seize is usually better. And you mainly want to focus on this outer ridge and this inner one, not so much the middle, but obviously you do want to still coat that. It's just important here and here because that's where the rotor makes contact. Try to avoid getting it on these studs. If your rotor is clean like this one, go ahead and put it on, but if it's old and rusty, consider scraping off or grinding off the surface rust on the inside so it can sit flat. Flip it over and install it. On the back side of this hub spacer, I'm also going to put anti-seize. If it's rusted and has rust buildup on it, sand it flat. Take this and slide it over the rotor and put at least one mounting nut on right off the bat so it can stay on, and then we'll put the rest on. Now with all of these mounting nuts started all the way around, I'm going to tighten them up and then we'll come back and torque them. And just like to loosen them, you gotta put your socket over, put your extension through and tighten them up. I'm going to try my best to go in a cross pattern so that this spacer can seat itself properly, but if it's not a perfect cross pattern, that's all right. Just try to go across so that you don't seat it on one side more than the other by accident. Don't over tighten these. We're going to, like I said, come back with the torque wrench and make sure that they are properly tightened. I have the torque wrench, just like I had the air impact, through the hub adapter here, the spacer, with my socket on there. The torque for all these is 130 foot-pounds, and to hold it still, I'm going to use a pry bar right in between the lug studs here, and just hold it from spinning, basically. That's it right there. Now, because these are already tightened, well, snugged up with the air gun, I'm not going to go in a cross pattern. I'm just going to go in a circle, but I'm going to mark the ones that I torque with a yellow marker so that I can make sure I don't accidentally go around on the same ones. And well, we're just going to go around and torque all of them. Once again, 130 foot-pounds. All torqued. Now take your caliper and slide it over the rotor. Line it up with the bracket, or the knuckle. Line the bracket up with the knuckle, is what I'm trying to say. As soon as at least one bolt lines up, start it in. There we go. Thread's caught on. That way you can let go and safely install the second one. Let's tighten them up, snug these up, and then we'll torque them to 166 foot-pounds. Once again, 166 foot-pounds. There you have it. Let's resecure this bracket. It has this pin on the further inboard side that has to line up on the spring seat. It's got a hole that it needs to line up with, and you know that it's lined up when that goes in and the bolt hole also lines up. So, try to get this as close as possible. It might want to fight you just because of the pressure that the caliper's pulling, but it's probably because I have the wheel turned all the way. If it's not turned all the way, it might be a little more easy. Thread it in. Nice and snug. If you need to, clean up this surface. It doesn't have to be perfect, just make sure it's somewhat flat so that the wheel can mount on flush, and then it's a good idea to either put a little bit of grease on here or anti-seize, and try to avoid getting it on the lug studs as much as possible, and of course on the brake surface, or the brake rotor surface. I'm going to use my jack to roll this wheel on. It's very heavy. Now put on all 10 of your lug nuts, bottom them out in a cross pattern, and torque them down to 165 foot-pounds, also in a cross pattern. There you have it, they're all torqued.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.